Each day after school, Thomas Valero noticed his young daughter in tears, sensing that something was terribly amiss. When he finally uncovered the root of the issue, he was stunned by what had been happening. Determined to reveal the truth, he resorted to a cunning and discreet plan. Starting school can be tough for kids. They need all the support they can get from their parents to help them adjust. Even with a good teacher, it's still a scary time because of new routines, new faces, and a new environment. It's even harder if a child has to deal with a strict or mean teacher. When Thomas noticed his daughter having trouble adjusting to school, he knew something was wrong and wanted to find out what was making her so unhappy. Every parent wants the best for their child, and it's normal to worry when they are hurting. Thomas was no different. He grew more worried every day as he saw his daughter struggle, and her behavior set off alarm bells in his mind. Thomas immediately noticed a change in his daughter. She became increasingly emotional after starting her new school. At first, Thomas assumed that it was simply nerves related to meeting new people and trying to perform well. But when it got worse over time, he knew that there was something more to it that he wasn't seeing. More and more often, Thomas' daughter began to cry and beg to stay home from school. Eventually, this became a daily routine in the Valero household. Every morning, his little girl would break down in tears. Thomas was, understandably, very worried about this. It kept getting worse until eventually, Thomas could no longer handle it. Days turned to weeks and weeks turned into months. All the excitement and joy seemed to be gone from his daughter. But what was worse, she seemed to grow increasingly frightened of going to school. Every morning was a battle of will, but she was clearly terrified. It got so bad that she soon didn't want to go to school at all. Being a concerned parent, Thomas tried to find out what was wrong. He tried talking to his daughter, but she clammed up and refused to tell the truth. Thomas knew he couldn't leave things like that. He also knew that he couldn't bear to see his daughter going on like this. But what was the alternative? Thomas' daughter was going to the Pine Grove Elementary School's kindergarten. Thomas had never noticed any problems with his daughter before this. Before she started the new school, she had always seemed to be a friendly, happy, healthy girl who was creative and easily made friends. Now she was like a different child. What happened? Thomas noticed that the change in his daughter had started once she started attending the new school. He could pinpoint the time exactly. This was when she went from being a happy little girl to an emotional wreck. Thomas began wondering about what was causing it. Could it be the school or the children or even a teacher? Until this all happened, his daughter had been doing well in school. She got good grades, not to mention the detailed feedback reports about her had all been positive for the most part. All the same, only a few months after she had started going to this school, her grades as well as her demeanor started to slip. To top it off, she would get emotional before as well as after school. What was happening? It became too much for Thomas to see his little girl act like this. He felt so powerless. However, he knew all the same that it was time to get to the bottom of the situation. He had reached a breaking point. We're sure any parent would feel worried about the well-being of their child. It was hard seeing his daughter unhappy every day. He was beginning to get more and more worried about her. The more he tried finding out what was wrong, the more the little girl shrank away. That's when he realized what could really be going on. He thought about it a lot. Then he came to the conclusion that she must be getting bullied by one of her classmates or even by one of her teachers. They had a stable and happy family life back at home, so he knew that couldn't be the root of his daughter's unhappiness. But how could he find out the truth? It's very important to be patient. It might even be one of the most important virtues we can all learn, even if it's difficult to practice. When it comes to teaching small kids, this becomes that much more valuable. If you ever had to deal with kids, then you know how hard they can be to handle. As an educator, patience is part of the job requirement. Even more concerning was that his daughter was still so young. She was in her formative years, meaning that she was going through a crucial and important time of her life. What happens during this time of her life will mold her into the adult she will be in the future. That's why it was so important that Thomas got to the bottom of it. Thomas and his wife raised their 2 daughters and one son with a certain mindset, always making sure to surround them with positivity and encouraging them to be their best selves. They know how important it is to develop a strong sense of self in kids to prepare them for what the future holds. Thomas wasn't going to let all his hard work be for nothing. Keeping Thomas and his wife's family values in mind, it makes sense that a harsh, mean teacher can seriously harm the children she cares for in the classroom. Thomas and his wife definitely didn't want that for their little girl. They started suspecting that they were only just discovering the tip of the iceberg and uncovering a much bigger and ongoing problem. Being a resourceful person, Thomas decided he needed to figure out what was going on with his daughter. He was having a hard time since his daughter was too young and shy to tell him about what was going on with her. It was time for the worried dad to take matters into his own hands. Being the father that he is, he couldn't just let his daughter get sadder and sadder with each passing day. He had enough and decided he was going to be the one to do something about it. The only question was how. He thought about it for a while. Then he finally came up with the perfect plan. But how would Thomas hear what was happening at school without having to be there at the time? He knew that if he asked to sit in on the class one day, the teacher would just change her behavior. He needed a more creative solution to make sure he was catching her in the act. And so Thomas decided to listen, and literally, he planned and built a tiny hearing device. The next morning, he carefully placed it in his daughter's hair. This would allow him to listen to exactly what was going on at her school. Hopefully, it would allow him to understand what she was experiencing there. He knew this was a very drastic way to go about it, but it was important to him. It was important not only to know what was going on, but to have proof on hand as well. He didn't tell his daughter what he was putting in her hair since he thought it might distract her throughout the day. Thomas couldn't wait to see what would happen over the course of the school day. He waited for his daughter at the door and smiled at her as she ran up the driveway. He was excited to finally get that smile he knows and loves back on her face again. And soon he'd know exactly what had been troubling her. When Thomas started listening to the recording when she came home, he was shell-shocked about what he heard. After listening to the whole thing, he was absolutely livid. He couldn't believe that this had been going on for so long. But even though he was furious, he was still glad that he finally knew what was going on. From the recording, it sounded like the teacher was being very mean to the students in her class. Thomas continued listening to the recording and realized this must be the reason for his daughter's problems. He knew there was no time to waste. It was time for him to do something about it. He had to act fast. He could tell that the teacher was taking advantage of her position and power. It hurt and infuriated Thomas to hear the person they had paid to care for their daughter behaving so callously. But why? He really couldn't wrap his head around it at first. Why would she do this to her young students? As he was listening, he found out that the teacher not only said offensive things to her students, but her condescending tone was also unnecessarily mean. The recording allowed Thomas to hear just how much she screamed and yelled at the kids in her care over the most trivial things. What should he do now? It sickened Thomas to see a teacher behave this way, so he raised the issue with the public school district. Instead of confronting the teacher directly, he went to the state school board, hoping for change. He set up an appointment to share his and his daughter's story. Despite having proof and a valid complaint, the school district did nothing to help. They claimed to have disciplined the teacher, but didn't remove her from his daughter's class. Thomas felt this response was inadequate and decided to take matters into his own hands. The school offered to move his daughter to another class, but Thomas was concerned about all the kids affected by Mrs. Duncan. He stood up for his daughter and the other children, refusing to accept the school's lack of support. He created a petition on change.org, which quickly gained traction. Soon, parents everywhere were outraged and over 2,000 signatures were collected demanding Mrs. Duncan's dismissal. Soon, the public rallied around Thomas, gathering over 2,000 signatures to remove Mrs. Duncan. Local news picked up the story, and Thomas found himself in the media spotlight for his fight for justice. The story quickly spread nationwide, ensuring that people everywhere heard what Mrs. Duncan did, even if Thomas couldn't get her fired. This gave him hope that change could still happen. The worst part of Mrs. Duncan's actions was the lasting impact on Thomas' daughter and her classmates. Without Thomas noticing his daughter's unusual behavior and digging deeper, she could have been traumatized for life. He was glad he tried to stop it, knowing it also affected other kids. Being a good role model requires self-reflection, and Thomas learned that sometimes things are beyond his control. Despite this, he would go to great lengths to protect his daughter and prevent other kids from facing the same problem. Teachers are meant to inspire and shape young minds beyond the curriculum, leaving a positive and lasting impact on their students' lives. It's never right for teachers to use fear and abusive behavior to control students. This only makes kids more anxious and slows their progress. Did Thomas' efforts to fix the problem work? Let's find out. Mrs. Duncan still teaches at the school, but hopefully she's realized how harsh she was. Thomas remains hopeful that changes will happen because he knows he's doing the right thing. Thomas felt like the school was putting kids at risk because of one teacher's short temper. He knew he had to take a stand to make a difference. Despite the challenges, this ordeal made Thomas and his daughter stronger. He learned the importance of paying close attention to his daughter and how she's doing. Now his daughter is in a different class, and Thomas is a better dad for what he's learned. He and his wife will always stand up for their kids. Without great parents like them, their daughter would still be bullied by her teacher. Since the day their daughter left the hospital, Thomas and Lacey have always put their children first, caring for all three of them. Aaliyah is lucky to have such a strong support system.